Hello, welcome. I'm Emily Mello, Dr. Robert Nathan Mayer, Senior Director of Learning and Public Programs. Before we begin, please take a moment to turn off your cell phones unless you are using them for captioning. I would like to thank our generous funders, a full list of whom for this exhibition and talk you can see on the slide. And I would like to thank you all for coming to this roundtable, which will offer entry points or lines we hope you will further explore into the transcendent depths of Virginia Jaramillo's work and life, her abstract paintings and handmade paperworks from 1960 to today, and her role in collective change in contemporary art that continues to resonate with those who desire new ways of seeing and understanding art in the world. The exhibition and the conversation reflects the MCA's commitment to further equity across gender lines and promote the work and ideas of women artists. I, like many people, did not know Virginia Jaramillo's work nearly as well as that of her many canonized generational peers. It is the persistence of Jaramillo's decade-long practice and the work of many enthusiasts who shed light on the importance of her history. Among those champions of her work in my sphere, our friend and colleague, former Aldorf Chief Curator Renee Morales, who is responsible for Jaramillo's work entering the collection of the Perez Art Museum Miami in his role as Chief Curator there previously, and in co-organizing Virginia Jaramillo, Principal of Equivalence for MCA Chicago with Iris Colburn, Curatorial Associate, who has beautifully stewarded the exhibition we celebrate the opening of today. For this conversation, Iris is joined by Aaron Dejic, who worked closely with Virginia, who organized this first retrospective of Jaramillo's work at the Kemper, and Catherine Morris, who included Jaramillo's work in We Wanted a Revolution at the Brooklyn Museum. We wish Virginia could be with us today to again hear a collective celebration of her achievements, but we send her well wishes while she is taking care in New York. Now I am pleased to briefly introduce our guests, and you can find their full bios on our website. Erin Dejic is curator and writer based in New York. She is deeply committed to women artists globally, and her practice is centered on amplifying historically excluded artists. Previously, she was director of curatorial affairs at Kemper Museum of Contemporary Art in Kansas City, Missouri, where she organized the exhibition Virginia Jaramillo, Principal of Equivalence, and edited the monograph by the same name released in 2023, which you can find in our bookstore. She also edited the catalog accompanying the exhibition of the same name, Magnetic Fields, Expanding American Abstraction, 1960s to Today, released in 2017, which includes new scholarship on the intergenerational impact of 21 women artists of color working in abstraction. She has written extensively on contemporary art and culture. Her most recent book, a monograph on artist Denzel Forrester, will be released in 2024. Erin has collaborated with noted contemporary artists, including Polly Apfelbaum, Sia Armajani, Firale Baez, Angela Dufresne, Rashid Johnson, Jose Lerma, Liza Liu, Rafael Lozano Hemmer, and Pepe Mar, to name a few. Previously, she was curator at the Savannah College of Art and Design. Catherine Morris is senior curator for the Elizabeth A. Sackler Center for Feminist Art at the Brooklyn Museum, where, since 2009, she has curated and co-curated numerous exhibitions, including Nona Faustine, White Shoes, up through July 2024, Lorraine O'Grady, Both and We Wanted a Revolution, Black Radical Women, 1965 to 1985, as I mentioned. Virginia Jaramillo is in that show. Judith Scott, Bound and Unbound, and Materializing 6 Years, Lucy R. Lepard, and the Emergence of Conceptual Art. She has worked on projects examining contemporary practices through historical precedents, including It's Problematic, Picasso According to Hannah Gatsby, and the museum-wide Sackler Center 10-year anniversary project, The Year of Yes, Reimagining Feminism at the Brooklyn Museum. She has worked on exhibitions and curatorial projects with Mary Enoch Elizabeth Baxter, Beverly Buchanan, Ava Hess, Suzanne Lacey, Marilyn Minter, Nellie Mae Rowe, Lorna Simpson, Kiki Smith, Cecilia Vicuña, and many others, and produced exhibitions such as Twice Militant, Lorraine Hansberry's Letters to the Ladder. and newspaper fiction, The New York Journalism of Dejuna Barnes, 1913 to 1919, and The Healing Wounds of War, The Brooklyn Sanity Fair of 1864. Upcoming projects include Elizabeth Catlett, a revolutionary artist and All That Implies, which opens in Brooklyn in September in 2024 and is presented in partnership with the National Gallery of Art, Washington, D.C. We couldn't be more thrilled to have these speakers join us to talk about Virginia Jaramillo's legacy. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to see so many of you here as we celebrate the opening of Virginia Jaramillo Principle of Equivalence. It's a real honor to share the stage with you both, Catherine and Aaron. I have to say I love your sneakers. I was saying my soccer team would be very disappointed in me right now. I also want to thank you, Aaron, again, for trusting me and my colleagues with this exhibition. It's been such a pleasure to work with you and to talk about Virginia Jaramillo all day long. As some of you know, I first encountered Virginia's work back when I was in graduate school, when one of her most iconic paintings, Green Dawn, was on view at the Smart Museum. Green Dawn is a green field with a yellow curving line that, in the great artist Frank Bolling's words, whips across the canvas. This painting has always stayed with me, how it does so much with so little. It turns out that show and that painting also introduced Renee to Virginia's practice. And across here on the slide, we also have the curvilinear that Renee acquired for the Perez Art Museum. And if you've seen the show, I hope you'll notice that this line is also translated onto the exterior wall of the show to really underscore Virginia's incredible commitment to the line. That's all to say, it feels like such a lucky full circle moment to be working on this show and to have the opportunity to talk with you both today, especially because I think there's still a lot to unpack about Virginia's practice, about her enduring fascination with geographical forms, mythology, ancient ruins, cosmology, even quantum physics, as well as her long-standing commitment to both the formal and the social potential of abstraction, her participation in political projects, her decades-long engagement with handmade paper, and the recent wide resurgence of interest her work has garnered. So before all that, I would love to open the conversation by hearing from you both. What first drew you to Virginia's practice, and what made you want to engage with it in such a profound, significant way?
Yeah, thank you, Iris. I just want to say a quick thank you to Madeline Grinstein, to Renee Morales, and to Iris specifically, who helped bring this exhibition here. It's been amazing to work with everyone, and I'm really pleased with the exhibition in the galleries here. It's tremendous. It's an iteration that's very different than it was at the Kemper Museum, and that's what I wanted, because I think it's just as much a conversation between curators as it is with how we're kind of thinking about this artist's work in deeper ways, and I appreciate Iris's vision for this show. I came to Virginia's work because it's in the collection of the Kemper Museum of Contemporary Art in Kansas City. She had a dealer there for many, many years who placed her work in institutional collections and in private collections as well. And the Kemper Museum has these two pieces that are up on the screen. And I kept looking at them on thumbnails, as one does when they can't have access all the time to storage. And I said, I really got to get these out and look at them, because I kept flipping through and seeing them and just being so intrigued. And kind of at the same time, she was having her exhibition, a solo exhibition of new work at Hales. And so at the same time that I was starting to make a larger investigation of these works from 1990 and in the 1970s, she also had a painting of new work at Hales. And when I saw it, I was like, oh my God, this is the artist that is in the Kemper Museum collection. And I was like, no wonder I'm so drawn to these paintings. And I was just sucked in and stayed in the space for a really long time and immediately came back to the museum. It was just like, I need to figure out, more about this artist and learn more about her, meet her, all kinds of stuff. And so it started there, and I just simply called her and had just like a wonderful conversation. And she was so warm and wonderful, and we hit it off and started chatting. And there was an anniversary coming up at the Kemper Museum, and so I put the Principle of Equivalence piece in a group show to celebrate the anniversary and contextualize that work with Hans Hofmann and with Rashid Johnson, just to kind of make that bridge of abstraction that was happening in the museum's collection and have a bigger conversation about how she was situated in there. And it gave me just a fantastic excuse to say, like, oh, we're having all these wonderful artist dinners. I'm going to invite Virginia as one of the artist dinners, as a way to get her to Kansas City. And in talking with her, it just turns out the Hallmark collection, the Dom Museum, KU, private collections, and the Kemper Museum, along with a lot of other private collectors, had her work. So I was like, it's a story about Virginia's work and the way that she wanted to tell it, but it's also a way to interject her relationship with Kansas City, which I thought was important geographically for the space, for people to acknowledge like what a significant artist had such an impact in Kansas City on the collecting history during a very small window. And so I invited her, and meeting her in person was even more special than talking with her on the phone. And I asked her if she'd be interested in doing something like having a big monographic exhibition and what her goals were, and it just happened from there. I also love abstraction. It was just like, who is this magical person that I need to know her, and I need to understand how these marks are happening on this surface, and really start to investigate it more. So that's my story.
Thank you. I'd also like to thank Renee and Madeline, and I'm thrilled to be on the stage with both of you to have this opportunity to talk about Virginia, who I'm also very grateful for. Because I have a different kind of relationship, and it's just been wonderful to have this opportunity to think about her work again, so I'm really grateful for that. I first became aware of Virginia as an artist when I moved to New York to go to graduate school around 1990, and back in those days you would get your apartment and your job out of ads in the back of the Village Voice, and I got a job randomly at a place called the New York Feminist Art Institute. And I always like to call it out because it was an amazing place that allowed me to work part-time on a living wage, which was like $75 a day, and they gave me health insurance, which is a remarkably feminist thing, in my opinion. And I knew that Virginia was affiliated with them, and knew her mostly in that context of sort of downtown New York scene. Most of my work as a curator particularly my earlier work, was focused on kind of alternative practices in the 1970s, mostly in downtown New York. And so I've often had this experience, I don't know if many people in this room have, where you think you know something you think you know an artist, but then when you sort of scratch the surface, you know a couple of slides that you saw in an art history class or that are reproduced in magazines that you've seen. And so it wasn't until years later when I was working on the exhibition We Wanted a Revolution with my colleague Rujeko Hockley that I got the opportunity to really think about Virginia's work in multiple communities and in relationship to a very important conversation in that exhibition that focused on the nature of a feminism that was, in my opinion, broader than even the word feminism, which does not appear in the title, and it involves communities that were not necessarily, though some artists were, many were, including Virginia, part of the kind of second wave feminist movement in many ways, though, as we know, a movement dominated by white women. So having the opportunity to think about her work, to think about abstraction, and to think about her place in multiple communities at a time in which we were contextualizing this work in a specifically political context. And how do we do that, and what is the meaning of that in relationship, particularly to abstraction, is just a fascinating conversation that I'm sure we'll get into.
Yeah, thank you so much, Catherine. I'm really excited to get into that and to think about what did it mean for Virginia to make this kind of work in the 60s and 70s and so forth. But before we get into that, I'd love to spend a little more time thinking about Virginia's longstanding commitment to abstraction and what her language of abstraction is, where it comes from, what drives it. And so to do that, I thought we could spend a little bit of time with what's come to be often used as her artist statement, which is that she describes her practice as an aesthetic investigation which seeks to translate into visual terms the mental structural patterns we all superimpose on our world. So a little wordy. But I'd love to think with you both, what does she mean by this, and how has she approached this through the language of abstraction?
Can I start by just saying, because I know you have a lot, probably more to say about this than I do, but I think that one of the amazing things about walking through your exhibition, which was just such a pleasure last night, is the way that the exhibition, in a very straightforward way, I think lays out, that in combination with the catalog, lays out the really interesting entree into an abstract practice that begins with a very personal experience of the world, and the way that for her as an artist, that life experience gets translated into this incredibly long and rich engagement with abstraction is one of the wonderful things you can really trace through the show, which I think is just great.
I'm not one, I sort of resist chronology a lot of the times, but I think it was important in this exhibition in relationship to a quote like this, where it really made sense because you can actually draw yourself through the various points in Virginia's career where she's actually making those aesthetic investigations. And, they range from something as, wonderful as a memory where she's recalling riding her bicycle over a landscape in Southern California near her grandparents' turkey ranch, which is translated into the kind of dry, cracked earth of the black paintings, all the way to investigations of the philosophy of Ma, which says you can take away so much information within a painting, but realize that there's such a balance between the negative and the positive space that simply a line can tell you enough information that you need to know. So she's looking at these philosophical investigations. She's looking at memory as a way to investigate her space, but she's also expanding that. It's not always such a personalized context. She's thinking about ancient cultures and how the relationship of their architectural spaces and their land masses and forms become her own abstract forms. It's her way of unpacking this information. Something like Stonehenge, which was the work that was up with the quote, she is able to, that the site is the actual coordinates for Stonehenge. So you have to do a little investigating yourself if you want to know kind of what that is. She doesn't always give away the information too. And I think that's part of like her abstraction is that she's interested in these spaces and she wants to learn more, but her language is abstraction, so it makes sense. And one of the most poignant examples of her aesthetic investigations is when she transitioned into handmade paperwork. She said that she was in her studio one day and she saw a watermark. and something as simple as a watermark turned into 30 years of handmade paper making. So Virginia is someone who takes the deepest of deepest dives into what kind of sparks her interest, and she turned looking at a watermark on just like a regular letterhead into an entire body of work that created some of the most innovative handmade paperworks ever to come out of Dieudonné, the largest at least to ever come out of Dieudonné, and some of the most complex. And within those spaces, she kind of continues to look at those philosophical investigations, those personal memories, those kind of histories that she articulates throughout her entire series. So it made sense to do the exhibition chronologically because all of that sort of unfolds, and what you see in the more recent work from 2021 is she's actually starts to so wonderfully in some ways mine from her own practice. Some of the works from 2021 started to have paper put into them. That line comes back from some of the earlier pieces. There's this wonderful circular element that becomes repeated throughout different series. And so she starts to connect actually to the work that she was making during some of her more recognizable series and translates them into new work. And so, you know, starting to look at and in her own practice as a mode of investigation, I think is something that came out of this process, which I think is just, it shows how important the evolution of her practice is. And to watch that happen in her producing new work during the process of working on this monograph, she was making an entirely new body of work while working on 65 plus years of work. And so there's this kind of push and pull and motivation and doing a lot of deep thinking about her earlier work as she was making new work at the time. So all of that kind of coalesced into how this investigation happened in her practice, and especially translated into this show. So
I'm really glad you brought up chronology and why the show is organized that way. For me, I'm hoping that when people walk through, they see her own arc, you know, coming to the line from these really textured surfaces that we saw just moments, oh, there it is. And then coming into these really pristine, flat color fields with lines crossing through. And then she starts to break down the surface. The gestures, the brushstrokes become more gestural. You can start to see them over the canvas. And then the line disappears with the stain paintings. And turning to paper, what I find so interesting is that if she's taking away the line in the stain paintings, then she's literally dissolving the work in a more material way with the paperworks by making the paper itself. And I want to just pause here and stress that these are not works on paper, they are handmade paper. And we'll see a video of this process and get more into that. But it wasn't a brief stint as a major newspaper called this period in her career, but a very long engagement. But what really traces through the show is her engagement with the line. And translating that curvilinear from 1973 onto the wall gave me so much insight into just how ambitious those works are. And I can't tell you how much time we spent trying to carefully match the color, trying to get a really pristine line on the wall. So I'd love to hear from both of you, what drew Virginia to the line? And what does it do in her work? How does it function in the work?
Should I go? The process of looking at all the work and sort of understanding the chronology makes me keep thinking, and I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to articulate this very well because I've just been thinking about it in the last couple of days, but all of the work that Virginia does to me has a feeling that is very much a both and of depth and surface. And the ways in which depth appears in the curvilinears is perhaps, on the surface, the most abstract and the most sort of flat. But those curves completely change that. And your description of whether it's riding a bike so that things become grounded in a sense of land, environment, earth, and then sort of dovetails out into a more metaphysical discussion about atmosphere and space, or landscapes, or even like horizon lines. There's just seeing the work in combination really, I think, allows our minds to kind of wander with those kind of thoughts. And I know that the curves have been called whips, but when I look at them, the word that I keep thinking about is sliding. I feel like there's so much sliding going on with the forms that are made and the forms that the curves themselves are. So to me, it is always remarkable to see an artist use, as you've described, what seems to be such a small vocabulary, and yet the way that it brings you into looking is a real gift, and it's remarkable to experience that with the curvilinears, which is why I'm really thrilled that we have one in the Brooklyn Museum collection. So, because these are the kind of paintings you want to live with, right? And I think that also translates into what you were saying about the paper pieces, the handmade paper pieces. Those continue the conversation of what depth means within flatness, and the surface texture that she traces and integrates and then expands on and moves back and forth between over the body of her work, as you've described with the light work in particular. Just also points to a remarkable consistency in thought. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's kind of where when I've been standing and looking at the exhibition.
No, it's true. I think another one of the elements that started to reveal itself, and I think that in spending more time with the work, it revealed it too, is that you can kind of go in and consider like, oh wow, these seem like very different series. They seem like very different methods and materials and the way that she's dealing with the surface. But very quickly, it also opens up to, oh wait, actually there's a method here. There's a real focus on how the line can be transcribed into so many different ways and still have a huge impact. And I think what Virginia likes to do is challenge herself. It is not an easy task to create a balance of line and color within those same surfaces, even though it appears flat. And I think that that's just as challenging as adding a textural surface with a textural line, as is what's happening right here in these two particular pieces. So there's texture in the line, there's a shift in width in the line that you may not recognize right away, but it's her deep analysis of how these lines are going to engage on the surface and how the surface is treated that actually is the magical part that we can't really understand. It's that kind of moment and element. And you're right, that color, she also spent equally large amounts of time considering what color the surface was going to be and then what color the line was going to be, because that was important to her. She knows she was working with a pared down kind of sensibility to what she was working with on the surface. And what we end up with is an incredible sense of depth out of very little information, which I think is, that's her. That's her taking that information that she's using and creating that space within a flat surface that allows us to, really take a deeper dive into it. And I think that's what became one of the more intriguing things about Virginia's work, is that there's a linear language that's happening too. There's reference to X's, locations, like she's thinking about all of these different things, and it all feels so coalesced when you start to walk through the space and watching that line unfold and how she takes that curve into different eras. I mean, this half circle that you're seeing, or this kind of like half moon circle that's appearing on this is an inversion of the one that you're seeing on the paperwork that's in the Kemper Museum from the 90s, you know? And again, a lot of that information stems from an entirely other series, the Phoenix series that she was making, where it's like something simple as a coffee mug that left a stain on her desk that she then used to make these collages. Like, all of it starts to make sense. It's just that you have to spend time with it, and it starts to kind of come together in your own way. You can kind of come at it from your own space. But the line became very important early on, and because she's interested as much in the earth and the landscape as she is in the cosmos, it's everything in between. And I think that's where the horizon line kind of becomes a real stable point and exists throughout a lot of her practice. And it's a real it's a grounding element for us. Like, we can look at some of these pieces and say like, oh, that feels like a horizon, and then all of a sudden it opens up to these atmospheric spaces. I mean, even this is on the right-hand side is a paper piece, 2 pieces of paper that are mounted onto a canvas. There's a line in the middle. She could have overlapped that if she wanted to, but there's a distinction in the way that she organizes these works that allows us to have a certain sense of trajectory with this line. Sometimes it goes somewhere, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it might meet in space somewhere else, like Point Omega suggests, and sometimes it doesn't.
I love that you brought up horizons. Of course, we have a horizon very close to us with Lake Michigan, and that was one of the beautiful things installing the show that was a little surprising, is to see how often the horizon comes up in her work. But I've been thinking about it, and it really makes sense, thinking about the horizon as a geographical form. It alludes to how we perceive the world, of course. It's an imaginary distance, or an imagined distance. And I hope that everyone can, spend some time and find the horizons throughout the show. But I'd love to spend some time now thinking about the curvilinears and what it meant for Virginia to come to the line with those works in the 60s and 70s. Can you help us place these works in the broader debates around feminism, abstraction, painting?
I mean, and as Erin was talking, that's exactly where my mind was going as well, was in addition to sort of a more descriptive conversation about looking at abstraction, the other thing that obviously has to be taken into account when you're looking at these paintings is when they were made, and the art historical context, which obviously Virginia was very much aware of and a part of when she was making them. So that by the time in the 1970s, having lived in New York for a few years, having spent time in Paris, having made the decision with her family to move into the heart of what was the sort of avant-garde of the art world in Lower Manhattan, you can't look at these paintings without talking about the history of abstraction and the history of sort of post-abstract expressionism and the history of second-generation abstract expressionism and minimalism, and even into the moment of post-minimalism. And in addition to that, in Jaramillo's case, obviously, is also conversations that are going on in communities that she's engaged with, particularly Black communities, about the value of abstraction and the use of it as a tool for communication in a community that is often looking for conversations that have to do with the here and now and have to do with the politics of lived experience. And so to me, that's very interesting when stepping back from more of the looking and the descriptive and thinking about that historical context. I think that, to your question about feminism, the ways into a conversation about what makes art feminist are as varied as the artists who we talk about, right? And I am a curator of a Center for Feminist Art, not many of those around, and I do not think it's my job to be like the designator who is and who isn't feminist, but I do think that what my job and my position and my place in a historical museum offers is a methodological way of thinking about how feminism impacts the way we look at art and the way that artists make art. And I think in that context, we know that Virginia is fully engaged in feminism. I also think it's really important that artists get to decide if we have that conversation about their body of work or not in relationship to what they make. And I know that Virginia feels strongly about that as well. You know, I think about one of the major works that we house in my department is Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party. And the last artist on The Dinner Party is George O'Keeffe, who was still alive when Judy Chicago made that work, and she was not interested in being on that work of art. She was not interested in being contextualized as a feminist artist at this moment of emergent feminism in the 1970s. And that was a feminist position, because she was very determined to be, she had spent her whole life being called a woman artist, and that was not the term that she wanted. So I think about things like that throughout the conversations we have about different artists and what they want their work to convey or engage with. And now I feel like I'm rambling. Sorry.
I think Iris's essay is a kind of perfect example of these stories about, you know, we're looking at this work because it really feels like at the moment that Virginia was taking a feminist action and engaging with like a real linear and geometric abstraction during a time where it was very significant for women to express themselves in other ways. And so a lot of times, you know, she was just so in it that she wasn't necessarily always thinking of it as a feminist action. It's just something that she was compelled to do and felt that she was participating in a very aesthetic way, in a very kind of, you know, artistic practice focus, which I think itself is, at the time, we look at it as a very feminist action. And at the time, I think that being involved in organizations, being an editor for the Heresies issue on Third World Women, like she was very much a part of, oh wow, okay. Cue that right up, yeah. I didn't know that was the next slide. But I think that, you know, and you can speak to this experience too, because you know, your essay really touches upon those moments in which Virginia's work becomes an important part of the story of feminism, of how women engaged at that period of time in making significant works in the 1970s, which wasn't easy, never is easy. And I think Iris was really able to articulate an arc in Virginia's career that speaks to that and acknowledges the important moments that she served to be a part of a movement.
Thank you so much, both of you. I'd love to talk more about Third World Women, but I want to linger a little more with the curvilinears and thinking about them from a feminist perspective and what that might mean. And I think staying with We Wanted a Revolution, if we could pull that slide up, and thinking about how Virginia is placed here, I think it says so much. We have Howardina Pindell, of course, to the right, and then Lorraine O'Grady situated between them. Can you tell us, Catherine, why was Virginia important for this show, and why was this work in particular important to be in the show next to Howardina, next to Lorraine?
So much. The way that this particular gallery was situated really begins a conversation with just above Midtown Gallery. And that was important because it also marked in our exhibition the transition into a more conceptually based thread of feminist work by Black artists that was happening in New York and beyond, in California, in the 1970s and into the 80s. And so this was the place where we really pick up a conversation about women abstract painters. We began the exhibition with a moment of the Spiral Group and the conversations that they were having in the 1960s about the value of abstraction or the value of representational art. They also only included one woman artist in the Spiral group, and it was not Faith Ringgold, who was their peer. It was Emma Amos, who was 22 or 23 at the time. And I think about one of the things that Emma Amos famously said that I think also applies to this notion of feminism in relationship to Virginia, and that was, she said, for herself, as a Black woman, simply walking into a studio was a radical act. And I think that that is uniformly true in every artist in this exhibition. I loved the juxtaposition of Howardina and Virginia's work in relationship to the conversation about abstraction, because they both are abstract, and they both relate to the history of abstraction, one of the most important movements, obviously, in 20th century America, to which they are contributing. But also, to me, there was an interest in this juxtaposition because Howardina has more specific stories, as it were, that point to the kind of politics that she's building into her abstraction, her own life experiences, what the dots mean, how they appeared on the bottom of glasses when she was traveling through the South with her father. And so this abstract form of the dot for Howardina has a very clear political implication scattered across the surface of the history of abstract painting in America. But I thought that Virginia's approach was more subtle and more engaged with the nature of the choice to be an artist in the context in which she did. In, I think, the video that that's on the Pace Gallery website, you know, she talks about at the end, she talks about wanting to, correct me if I'm wrong, but the way that I interpret it, she kind of talks about not wanting to be obvious. Not wanting to, I forget the word she used. Do you remember? It's sort of like not wanting to.
She wanted it to feel like someone just threw a piece of yarn on top of a surface. Like, wanted it to feel very kind of intuitive.
Yeah. And my takeaway from that was the sense that part of her desire in coming to her abstraction was to cast a very wide net, not just for herself, but for her viewers. So giving you information, inviting you into a conversation, but not, which I think is, you know, the didactic criticism of more narrative art is sort of, you know, telling somebody what to think, or of political art. And I think that she was very interested in getting to her points exactly by not doing that. So all of that's contained within the notion of what it meant to be a radical artist in the context of being a woman, being a woman of color, in this period of the 60s through the 80s.
Thank you so much. Erin, I wonder if you can take us a bit more into Virginia's time during this period. Who she was talking to, where was her studio, when was she making work, what was she looking at, what were the things that were really driving her at this time?
Yeah, her studio was in Soho at the time, and she had just come back, well, not just come back, she had been back from Paris for a while, but had kind of been still percolating about her experiences there. And at that, a little bit later into the Curvilinear series, she started talking with Fred Brown. Daniel LaRue Johnson was her husband, who is also an artist. And, you know, having a household where you're constantly kind of thinking about art and, you know, having in-depth critical conversations about art and life and color, like that was kind of the energy around that time. And Virginia was interacting with musicians, she was interacting with poets, she was interacting with people who were also dancers. And so, like, all of that kind of coalesces into what was happening at that time. She talked about her studio almost being like this kind of mobile situation too. So, like, if she would talk about kind of like, oh, if someone was coming and we needed to move a wall, we just build a wall. And so it was like this, really, it sounded like, I wasn't there, but it sounded like this just really beautiful creative space where, you know, she was meeting with Frederick James Brown, Megan Brown, who is a dancer, being around jazz musicians. Like, there's this kind of fluidity of conversations that's happening. But amongst all of that, Virginia is a very serious artist. She takes her time in making her work as a very serious time that she blocks out for herself, where she can contemplate what she wants to do. And so oftentimes she would paint into the night because that's the time and space that was allotted to her. And she said that she often skipped a lot of openings and things because that was her time to paint and that was her time to work. And so there was this really wonderful engagement of critical thought and discussion about color and line and things. But then there was also I need this space. And I think that continues throughout her career now. I mean, she allots several hours during a day to paint, and that's what she does. I don't call her before a certain time because I know what she's doing, and I know where her head's at, and I know where her space is, and so she's always carved that space for herself. And I think that is a testament to how much work she was able to accomplish, the success of her allowing her to have her carving her own space to think about these kinds of work. So there was a bit of a push and pull. I think she has let me know that she was more of a solo endeavor kind of person, really to kind of work and keep to herself as much as she was part of a community as well.
Thank you so much. I wonder if we can talk about 1979. This is the year that the Heresies issue, Third World Woman, came out. And in it, and Virginia was, of course, one of the editors, but also in the issue under what's called the Other Portfolio, which was compiled by Zarina, one of Virginia's paper works from the Visual Theorem series was published. This was her first work with paper. I always found this fascinating. 1979, these two major things in her life happen. And there's kind of a temptation to read the turn to paper as this feminist act, thinking about Howardina talking about feminism allowed me to use glitter in my work. Virginia was, I never heard her say anything like that. I don't think she would say that. So I wonder if we could talk a little bit about this issue, and then, with an eye on the time, we can watch a video that shows Virginia's handmade paper process, which is really based in the watermark technique. But Catherine, since this issue was in We Wanted a Revolution, I wonder if you could just briefly introduce us to it.
Sure. The Heresies Collective was a group of white artists, art-related people, critics, Lucy Lepard, Harmony Hammond, any number of other people who came together to form a collective and started this publication called Heresies. Each issue, it ran from, I think, 1973 to about 1993. It ran a while. The collective would decide on a subject for each issue. I believe it was the third issue that was the lesbian issue that Harmony Hammond edited or led the collective on, and that was an issue in which the kind of privileged white point of view of the collective was really taken to task, specifically by the Combahee River Collective out of Boston. The collective did publish their letter and did make attempts to sort of address the racism that was inherent in their kind of privileged position that they were working from. So this issue came out of that, and the ways that the issues worked is there's the group of founders was called the Mother Collective, and then each issue would have another collective that would be formed to produce the issue. And this issue is fascinating to me for so many reasons. First of all, the term third world is one that's very interesting to me. It's actually why we invited Aruna D'Souza to write about that in our second publication for We Wanted a Revolution. And it's very interesting the way this collective, and your label in the exhibition quotes it, the decision to use that term and kind of the meaning of it. It's a term that very much grows out of a post-World War II geopolitical conversation, but it also, by the 1970s and late 1960s, becomes kind of a catch-all phrase for what we would now call BIPOC or other kind of conversations. And so the way that it's used in this issue is very interesting. Virginia was part of the original collective, I'm not the original collective, the collective, that put the issue together. And yeah, Erin, I don't know if you want to talk about the piece that's reproduced.
Yeah, Virginia was involved in the group of editors led by Zarina that was working on this particular issue. And at the time, she had just embarked on working with handmade paper. So this is a very early piece, probably it's from the first series, not the first piece, but from the first series that she started working on. And again, it's like one of those things, you have to see it in person. Like, that's the whole impetus of this show. Like, get the work out of storage and see it in person. Because the Xerox of this particular work, even within the publication itself, is like, okay, what's happening here? But I think that, she had been thinking about the watermark. And so this was the first investigations into that process, understanding through handmade paperwork how the watermark can happen, how you can create actual depth in a handmade paper. And what she's done here is actually created depth in a way that allows light to pass through the particular works. These are very thin in certain areas, and what you see is a lot of the light kind of passing through the surface. And she was really using this as an opportunity to explore not just some of the things that she was interested in, which was a lot of the foundations of ancient societies. Like in these works, you often see triangles and you see squares and you see these kind of like what might have been aerial views of certain landscapes or ancient sites, but also, you can see how she is allowing the handmade paper process itself to become visible. You can see the laid line marks inside the works, and it becomes part of the visual language that supports what she's doing. So she's taking the medium itself and actually using it as a way to incorporate into her own visual language. Like, these are very tiny linear marks that happen within this, and I think the video will definitely explains that a little bit more from one of the geniuses that Virginia worked with for her entire 30 years plus at Dieudonné, and her and Paul Wong, who was the first director for Dieudonné. He's an artist himself, and he worked really closely with helping Virginia to really push herself and push her practice, even though he said, I don't think she needed much of that. She was very like, I'm in here, I'm doing this all day, every day. And so, that's where this first Visual Theorems series kind of came from.
I wonder if the interest in time, we can invite everyone to watch the video after the talk, because I'd love to talk about how the paperworks have been contextualized. In the 1980s, Virginia was showing in a lot of exhibitions focused on paper, but she was also featured in several shows dedicated to artists of Latin American heritage. And she was interviewed by someone from Ms. Magazine, Gloria Steinem's magazine, about this phenomenon of mainstream institutions, as the writer calls it, quote, discovering these artists. And commenting on this phenomenon, Virginia says, if we could pull up the full quote, that would be lovely. There's an awakening to the fact that there are Puerto Rican and Mexican artists, but what's going to happen after these shows? I just find this quote so powerful. It says so much about Virginia, about how she was thinking about how she herself has been contextualized, what it means to be an artist, to continue making. And I wonder if you could think about what did happen after these shows.
Well, I think what was really wonderful is that she had a close relationship with Rufino Tamayo, who became interested in her handmade paper works as well. So her works actually made it into the collection of the Tamayo Museum in Mexico. She had family who worked in museums as well. And so a lot of times her work was contextualized in various handmade paper making exhibitions, focusing particularly on Latin American artists. But I think that, Virginia always says that it's like her superpower is that like she's like, nobody's watching me, I could do whatever I want, basically. I mean, she was very aware of what was going on and what was happening, and so her primary focus was honing in on her practice. And I think it's fantastic that there was, what it sounds like to me when she makes these quotes is like, yeah, that's great. I'm really happy to be in the show. I'm happy that this recognition is happening, but what's going to happen next? And what's kind of interesting is that I was on a panel a couple of days ago talking about this very topic, about kind of like, yes, we're doing a monographic exhibition, and that's really fantastic, and people are being introduced to Virginia's work, but what I wanted to encourage throughout this process was to inspire people, thinkers, scholars, writers, curators coming into the field to actually say, okay, they were able to kind of contextualize this one series just a little bit, but I'd like to think about that even more. So I think like really the visibility of these works and these types of exhibitions hopefully will kind of push people to think about them more, instead of being like, oh, you've hit this high point. Like, I don't know that this, I don't know that the monograph should be considered like a high point anymore. I think it should be considered like a, this fantastic moment to get a glimpse of what is possible and how we can go deeper, because that feels more reflective about how Virginia sees her practice than anything else.
So many thoughts about that, which I'm sure we'll get to, or maybe not, but I'm thinking of this period just looking at this announcement from 1986, and I think about 1986, I think about this is fully the emergent moment of the culture wars. This is when the AIDS crisis is hitting politics in a very particular way, and the art world in a very devastating way. It is kind of a moment where we do have this rise of this concept of multiculturalism that definitely takes a step back as you start to get into the 90s. So I wonder, how, I love the idea that, as you said, Virginia's somebody who's focused on her studio practice, and she's there. No matter what is happening outside her doors in relationship to politics of the world, she's still making her work. And she talks about that, right? She talks about the fact that she just kept making her work, which is so often the case with women artists, right? They just keep doing their work, and the attention ebbs and flows to whatever degree it does. You end up in one Whitney biennial, and then 20 years go by. So in relationship to the moment of a certain number of Latino or Latinx artists having some recognition, I mean, that's also obviously happening in the Black community as well. Lorena Grady certainly talks about it a lot, talks about, finding herself invited to be in shows and being in the conundrum of, it's a show, I want to be in a show, but I don't like the show, and so what do I do? This is a choice that you have to make, and it's kind of the thing that artists have to navigate with the invitations that they do get as they're trying to figure out how to organize themselves in relationship to the art world at large. So I think that historical ebbing and flowing is true. That happened. And I do like to think that it's, obviously, I don't like to think, but it is happening again, but I do like to think, and it does feel to me, that it is a history that's kind of a stupid term, that really has roots, that has had an impact on changing the field, that younger scholars are writing a different history, and it's not about writing in one. And we know that Virginia was often the one. She was the one woman, the one Mexican, the one, and that sort of tokenism, which really, in a lot of ways, probably described the way the art world dealt with the notion of cultural politics, identity politics in the 1980s, has changed, because there has been a shift in that understanding of the way cultural history needs to be recorded. So that's kind of the specific to that moment.
Thank you. I feel like Virginia's question of what's going to happen after these shows still rings true. And I wonder how many, or why this narrative has continued. even thinking about the language, the woman artists finally making it. But thinking about these two shows, Virginia Jaramillo and of course the beautiful Lorraine O'Grady show that you curated, Catherine, I've also been reflecting on how Erin talks about Virginia as being from the future. And Catherine, when we were sitting in the green room, you said, Lorraine says, I was waiting for my audience to come. So could you talk a little bit about this kind of reflection on artists waiting, or not waiting, but being from the future, rather? And that might be kind of a nice way to enter this conversation instead of hammering on the discovery model again and again.
Yeah, and I think that ties in directly to what Erin was just saying, right? You know, I often say, you know, the best, I think that traditionally, art historically, exhibitions, particularly monographic exhibitions, were meant to be definitive. They certainly didn't happen until after somebody was dead, so they couldn't be continuing to make work and expecting it to go into a show. I mean, that's one of the things that I've experienced a lot when I've worked with artists from an older generation. You know, you call them up and say, I want to talk about your work from 1983, and they're like, I'm still making work, you want to come to my studio? Which is a real thing. But the best exhibitions are not definitive, the best exhibitions are generative, right? The best exhibitions bring more exhibitions, and after we finished We Wanted a Revolution, the idea was very much looking at this group of women that we had brought together and thinking, and two things, thinking about the fact that most of them had not had monographic exhibitions, number one, and number two, that most of them understood from a very early part of their career that if their legacies were going to survive, they had to keep them themselves. So the number of times you have to go into somebody's archives that's not at the Archives of American Art, or it's not at the Getty, it's in somebody's drawer in their guest bedroom. Those two things just got me really thinking about what shows needed to come out of We Wanted a Revolution, for me personally. And so, working with Aruna D'Souza, my co-curator, the idea of Lorraine O'Grady was a great opportunity because she kind of functions in a space between the generations of the Black Power movement, of the emergent civil rights, gay rights, disability rights movements of the 70s, feminism, into the sort of conceptual moment that I think we still unfortunately call postmodernism. And so that felt like a really useful place to have a conversation. That happens to be why I'm now working on one of the oldest artists in that exhibition, Elizabeth Catlett, who tells a very different story of the trajectory of a very important approach to feminism across the literal history of the 20th century. And I like to think that your show is another example of the monographic shows that do come out of something like these shows. And I'm interested in what you're saying about these monographic exhibitions maybe not being the be-all, end-all. But when we were working on We Wanted a Revolution, we had a convening of a bunch of the artists to get an idea of what their priorities were. You know, we heard two things. We heard, on the one hand, we want to tell our story ourselves. But on the other hand, we are artists, we want people to contextualize our work and to talk about our work, so they wanted both of those things. And I do think that there's ways that we, as curators today, need to think about both those things in the monographic context.
Definitely. I mean, I think Virginia's show didn't like come out of smoke somewhere. It's like, there, you know, I tried to use language throughout the catalog and even in the planning of the exhibition to break down the kind of authoritative model a bit, you know, really recognizing that these two incredible paintings at the Brooklyn Museum for We Wanted a Revolution that I had seen prior to the exhibition became very important to the part of the planning. And, you know, to your credit, bringing that work into the museum's collection in addition to a drawing, like allows that work, and then lending it to the exhibition allows that story to continue as well as it did there. The Smart Museum's curvilinear, I mean, she's really well known for the curvilinear works because many people had written about them. Darby English's book 1971 really kind of gives a small chunk over to the significance of Virginia's Green Dawn painting and, also her inclusion as the only Mexican artist, the only woman artist included in that historic exhibition. So I think that started kind of generating some dialogue around it. But in the planning for the exhibition as well, it was also important for me to surround myself with people who knew about Virginia's work more than I did, and also the community of other artists that Virginia was working with. So it's important to acknowledge that there was a group of people who I was in constant conversation with throughout the planning of the exhibition that helped me understand Virginia's work more from how they had contextualized it as well. So it's I don't know, I really see it, and maybe this doesn't, it's not like I kind of wrote it as part of the title of the show, like we planned this together or whatever, but I think my goal as a curator was to make sure that this wasn't the kind of only end-all be-all definitive model of how Virginia's work should be contextualized, but hopefully it's open enough where people feel as if they can have points of engagement with the work, but it also acknowledge where these works had come from. That was really important for me to put that into the introduction, to acknowledge that within this timetable, there are plenty of other voices who are kind of creating this greater momentum around what Virginia has been doing, like this kind of coalescing with her goals for the show, which evolved and changed over time. I mean, we looked at the first layout together on, like a really crude looking layout thing, and she was like, huh. She's like, I never really saw these works together. She's like, I feel like I'm a colorist. I never really thought of myself that way. It was like, when you never get to see all those works together at the same time, the way that she thought about her work and the evolution of planning the show also became an important part of the show too. So her goals changed over time as well. And so those two things dovetailed together, and that became quite important for me.
She's such a colorist.
I know.
But what you were saying too, and I think it's important because it goes back to this idea of the discovery model. A lot of the things that PWIs do is and we are all the victim of marketing departments and ideas about bringing an audience. And, the idea of first is really not that interesting.
Yeah.
It's what's much more interesting is thinking about what you're building on. And all of these exhibitions build on legacies of work. For example, in the case of Elizabeth Catlett, the work of HBCUs that kept and supported artists during their lifetime. And that's the most important thing that we can open with, is that we're building on a lot of thoughtful people who saw something that a lot of institutions didn't see.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much. I think this is a beautiful moment to turn it over to our audience if there are any questions, but also we're lucky to have some people who are very close to Virginia. If Mark Johnson, if you want to say anything, Bentley Brown, I don't know if you're here. Hey. Thanks for being here, Frederick Brown's son. Any questions, thoughts? Oh, right here in the front, Paul.
This is probably a pretty basic question, but I'd always assumed the curvilinear works were also kind of references to the human body and the form, even like Genesis with its kind of like erotic charge of something being created. Is that not true, or is that part of it as well?
I think I haven't heard her say that, but in terms of the in terms of the body, I mean, these are large canvases, and she's having to actually like stretch herself over them. So I think like physically, like in the making of the work, that it feels very connected to the body. But I think they were more a philosophical investigation of the philosophy of Ma, where it was kind of like, how can we reduce something to its most kind of primary form and look both simple and complex at the same time?
I guess it also wondered, because like it also seems like when it gets reduced to that level, things start to become different things. Like in quantum theory, the particle becomes a wave at the same time, and then the line and the circle, where those two things come together, is in the horizon, where it's like the line is imagined, it's also a circle at the same time. So I guess I'm curious how, in the philosophy of Ma, like all those things kind of also get confused when it gets looked at super, super, super close, and everything kind of runs together.
I was just going to say multiple things true at the same time. Yeah. I definitely see the body, especially in the Red work, the untitled work from 1967. Thanks, Paul. Gareth.
This was a really incredible talk. I've actually only seen the Virginia at the Smart Museum. It's the only time I've actually ever seen her work in person, but the talk about the line is really interesting, and I'm wondering if any of you have any points on how she kind of subverts the teleology of the line, where instead of being point A to point B, it becomes something that's actually really indeterminate and kind of subverting our expectations from going, one factor to the next. It's so playful and kind of mischievous how she undermines that.
That's so interesting. It makes me think about, going back to the body, it makes me think about movement through space, right? Whether it is literally as a child on a bicycle or stretching yourself in the canvas in relationship to the way the mark gets made, but also just more philosophically, the notion of the journey in some way, which I'm sure she would hate. It's not the getting there, it's the journey. But it's an interesting observation.
Actually, it's a great point because it actually references kind of her interest in space and the infinity of space and how, even though she's dealing with the two-dimensional surface, she really, in many ways, is always suggesting something off the surface. And, on some of the curvilinears, the paint will wrap around the edge and sometimes they don't. So you can imagine them going off into space in various directions, either continuing or taking a curve and going through. And so she is able to almost give us a bit of a three-dimensional kind of moment. Then you have like point omega, which references, the actual possible future connection of space and the future connection of lines in space. And that continues with works like this, these kind of these relationships to quantum physics and the connections of molecules and how those engage in space, or actual stars and cosmology, that kind of infinite space that is an explorative space. So, yes.
Thank you all for the talk. I was actually wondering, it's kind of a very specific question for Erin maybe, which is about the Kansas City connection. Especially I was reading further down in that kind of quote from Virginia about what happens next, and she says that she wouldn't have been able to stay alive if it weren't for the gallerist in Kansas City. So I was just wondering, how did that connection come about, and did she have a connection to the city at all, or?
Yeah, her gallery dealer many years ago started his career in Kansas City and then was in New York for about 12 years. And someone had said, you need to meet this artist. And so he went to her studio, and this was early 1970s, I believe. And he was like, oh my God, her work is amazing. And he just became really enthralled with it. And it was at the time where she was kind of moving into handmade paperwork. So most of the works that exist in Kansas City are handmade paperworks, because after being in New York for a decade, he moved back to Kansas City. And when he moved back to Kansas City, he started placing her works in and around the greater Kansas City area. And it was at the time that she was making handmade paper. And one of her first exhibitions of the stained paintings was in Kansas City. So maybe 2 miles from the museum where this exhibition took place, she had one of her first solo exhibitions, and it was the stain paintings. And so he kind of early on championed her work, especially at a time which was kind of interesting for her career, where she made quite a shift. So that's how those works happened in Kansas City. There's works in law firms, there was works in private collections. It was a real joy to actually just kind of not have to go far. And I was like, this is weird. Like I thought, when I
it's
see
one of
these
the interesting things about what happened to handmade paper in the world in the 80s. It became it became a thing, and it became a thing that art consultants placed in banks and law firms because it was very palatable in a lot of ways. The sort of, it makes me think of the era of handmade paper and plexi boxes. And it's very interesting in this show and through the videos that everybody should definitely watch, that you see the way that Virginia's approach is obviously much more engaged in very deep art historical connection, more than. So it's kind of a funny moment, art historically in the popular culture in that way in the 80s.
Exactly. She was also working with Carol Rosenberg, who was placing some of her handmade paperworks in and around New York, Pittsburgh area as well. And the dealer, Douglas Drake's wife, actually is an art historian and was also very enthralled with Virginia's work, and so took a lot of time. And she was working for corporate collections at the time, so was placing a lot of Virginia's works in corporate collections in and around New York City. And so that at that moment, there was attention towards her work in a way that allowed it to make its way into collections. Very different now.
And a very particular moment in the art market.
Yes.
There was a specific clarification about the handmade paper not being work on paper, and I imagine that seeing this video might contextualize a lot more about the process, but even just hearing now the plexiglass being an accessible or maybe more public-private space, like seeing her work out in the world, and also maybe alluding to some tendencies in craft. I'm curious if this work is considered sculpture then, or is it just handmade paper and that's like meant to be sort of a new genre or like the beginning of a new way of making? Like, is she predating the craft? Is she revolutionizing it? And is it sculpture?
You were the one who made that comment, Aaron, so I'll let you explain. But I do love the fact that throughout this exhibition, I've been really thinking about, I find myself continually thinking about sculpture and sculptural materiality in relationship to these works.
The piece in the show, which is quite new to the checklist, that is 2 X's. It feels like stone. So I think that there's like it. To me, there's a sculptural element to it. There's a thickness to the paper, and you have to like keep adding layers to it, so it does feel that way. I haven't heard her mention that, but what I will say, it feels like a beautiful extension of the stain paintings into the paper. The stain paintings became very much about watering down the surface, watering down the medium, and then the amount of water that's used in order to make the handmade paperworks. Like that element, that earth element, various earth elements continue throughout her work, that became really significant to the handmade paperworks, was water at its center. But you make a really good point. They feel very sculptural.
It's really interesting because with anonymous site number 603 from the Kemper collection, which is the work that is kind of at a diagonal, or it feels that way, she told me, this is not a handmade paperwork, this is a painting. And I was bringing someone through the show and they said, oh, is that a stained painting? And I thought that was really fascinating. And the process of staining the painting, how she was letting paint fall and then rotating the canvas. She does something very similar with the paperworks, letting, as Paul Wong describes, she would let the paper pulp into the vat and then run to the other side, put it in again. So it's similar kind of flowing of paper full of paint or, colored pulp. So I think that's a really interesting question to think about it in more sculptural terms. And with the untitled work with the X's, for me it feels very photographic. But all this is to say that I think when Virginia was turning to paper, a lot of people were trying to push different media or their own medium wherever they were coming from. And for example, Paul Wong did a show in 1985 called Paper as Paint. So bringing together a group of painters that were thinking about painting through the medium of handmade paper.
Well, and one of the most direct outcomes of the conceptual art movement beginning in the late 60s is a specific desire on the part of many artists to just frame their work differently by calling it a different media, intentionally, including conceptually. Lucy Lepard called 6 Years her book the best show she ever curated. And so the same way that many artists, in this period are specifically trying to think about what it means to make paper pulp, for example, as a sculptural material that is flat.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else? Well, I hope you all get to watch the video. It was made in collaboration with Dudonné Paper Mill, and we really thank our colleagues over there. So maybe we'll close here, and I hope to see you in the show or elsewhere. Thank you both.
Thank you.